nosotros se los pueda colgar en la plataforma de OEA, porque es un poco la dinámica que nosotros quisiéramos mostrar.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos, no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Development cooperation has always been a priority for the OAS. The OAS SETI works with all member states to identify common challenges and define solutions through policy dialogue, which is transformed into action through technical cooperation initiatives. Policy dialogue is central to our work in development. The OAS SETI convenes development leaders in 11 ministerial meetings and high-level processes on priority areas such as competitiveness, labor, education, among others. Technical cooperation initiatives emerge from ongoing dialogue and are therefore established with built-in political support. All of our actions place people at the center, generating a multiplier effect in the region. We enhance human capacity by working with key stakeholders. This strengthens institutions, improving policies and programs, benefiting millions of people in the Americas. Our ability to deliver results relies on broad collaboration. Partnerships for Development, Cooperación Solidaria, is a unique OAS concept which recognizes that each member state, regardless of its size, wealth, or level of development, has value to share and can learn from others. This concept also includes close collaboration with other partners, amplifying our reach and impact. As we mark 70 years of work on development, we take a look back. This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation, and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the 2030 Agenda. These priorities are also areas where the OAS SETI has extensive experience and proven impact. We have come a long way. but still have much work to do. "70 years ago, an inter-American dream and promise was enshrined in the OAS Charter. We can deliver on this promise. Our future leaders are counting on us."
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Development cooperation has always been a priority for the OAS. The OAS SETI works with all member states to identify common challenges and define solutions through policy dialogue, which is transformed into action through technical cooperation initiatives. Policy dialogue is central to our work in development. The OAS SETI convenes development leaders in 11 ministerial meetings and high-level processes on priority areas such as competitiveness, labor, education, among others. Technical cooperation initiatives emerge from ongoing dialogue and are therefore established with built-in political support. All of our actions place people at the center, generating a multiplier effect in the region. We enhance human capacity by working with key stakeholders. This strengthens institutions, improving policies and programs. benefiting millions of people in the Americas. Our ability to deliver results relies on broad collaboration. Partnerships for Development, Cooperación Solidaria, is a unique OAS concept which recognizes that each member state, regardless of its size, wealth, or level of development, has value to share and can learn from others. This concept also includes close collaboration with other partners, amplifying our reach and impact. As we mark 70 years of work on development, we take a look back. This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation, and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the 2030 Agenda. These priorities are also areas where the OAS SETI has extensive experience and proven impact. We have come a long way. But still have much work to do. "70 years ago, an inter-American dream and promise was enshrined in the OAS Charter. We can deliver on this promise. Our future leaders are counting on us."
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OAS y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo lo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children and they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
The OAS official Facebook page. So apart from having
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos, no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Development cooperation has always been a priority for the OAS. The OAS SETI works with all member states to identify common challenges and define solutions through policy dialogue, which is transformed into action through technical cooperation initiatives. Policy dialogue is central to our work in development. The OAS SETI convenes development leaders in 11 ministerial meetings and high-level processes on priority areas such as competitiveness, labor, education, among others. Technical cooperation initiatives emerge from ongoing dialogue and are therefore established with built-in political support. All of our actions place people at the center, generating a multiplier effect in the region. We enhance human capacity by working with key stakeholders. This strengthens institutions, improving policies and programs, benefiting millions of people in the Americas. Our ability to deliver results relies on broad collaboration. Partnerships for Development, Cooperación Solidaria, is a unique OAS concept which recognizes that each member state, regardless of its size, wealth, or level of development, has value to share and can learn from others. This concept also includes close collaboration with other partners, amplifying our reach and impact. As we mark 70 years of work on development, we take a look back. This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation, and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the 2030 Agenda. These priorities are also areas where the OAS SETI has extensive experience and proven impact. We have come a long way.
Great. Good morning to all of you. I would like to welcome you to this 4th discussion of the Emergency and Safety Systems community, both to our KUDO participants as well as to those who are watching us live on the OAS official Facebook page. So before I actually begin with the introduction to this panel, I would like to mention that the KUDO platform has English, Spanish interpretation. So for those who need that interpretation, please go to the lower left side of the platform. There is a button that says floor, and you're going to have to click on the arrow, and from there you can select the language of your preference. And so now I would really like to greet our panelists that have joined us here today virtually. We have with us Matthew Schenk from Lancaster Countywide Communications 911 from the state of Pennsylvania, US, who, despite the fact that he is on vacation, he still accepted our invitation. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us here today. We also have Wilfrido Munoz from ECU 911. He's based in Quito, in Ecuador, and it is always a pleasure, Wilfrido, to have you and to have the opportunity of engaging with you in what I think will be a very lively and very interesting discussion here with you. So thank you so much for also joining us. And we also have Tessa Segworth. She's from Mission Critical Partners. This is the second time that Mission Critical Partners decides to join us in one of our community's events. And we are extremely grateful with Mission Critical Partners for your support and for your interest in the work that we are doing in the Americas. So thank you, Tessa, for doing this. And we also have Marta Acevedo Silva and Rose Michael from ENA. They're both based in Brussels, in Belgium. So thank you for joining us despite the time difference. And it is a real honor and a real pleasure for me to be able to be moderating this highly skilled and experienced group of specialists here today. And so I'm going to ask my colleague Joel if he can start sharing the presentation that I prepared for you today, so that I may introduce the topic and so that I may also introduce the panelists a little bit better. And so here today, what we're going to try to do is try to focus more on the topic of crisis communication. So if we can go to the second slide, Joel, thank you so much. And so we're going to be talking about crisis communication within the specific realm of emergency and safety systems, with a particular focus on the US, on Ecuador, and then we're going to jump over to Europe in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The topic at first may seem a little bit redundant, if you want, given the fact that emergency and safety services are constantly dealing with and responding to different types of emergencies affecting individual people, individual cases, but also affecting small, medium, and large scale areas. Because of their nature and the purpose for which they were created, one would assume and even, of course, expect that as part of their communications plans and strategies, emergency and safety agencies incorporate a strong component of crisis communication, particularly when they have to deal with high impact, large scale events. In previous sessions, and I'm going to ask Joel to go to the next slide, particularly for those who have been following us in these online webinars, we have been exploring how COVID-19 has impacted on emergency and safety services from different perspectives. And so, for example, we discussed COVID-19's impact on management and operations. We try to better understand, for example, how different agencies were dealing with an increase of volume calls. We also try to understand how they were preparing and adapting the facilities to avoid the spread of the virus, how they protect and support their staff, but also how they had to seamlessly train new staff, get new staff on board quickly to replace those who got sick. Also, how to ensure adequate financial resources throughout the entire crisis. And one of the final sessions had to do with preparing emergency and safety services for a scenario where different kinds of hazards converge, including, for example, meteorological hazards such as hurricanes, tornadoes, or wildfires, together with a biological hazard such as the current pandemic. And so in this fourth session, we will try to better understand how COVID-19 has impacted or is impacting the communication plans and strategies of emergency and safety systems, both in the Americas and then in Europe. And so in order to address this topic, we will try to answer some of the following guiding questions that you're seeing on screen. How does crisis communication fit within the broader realm of crisis planning and crisis management? How does it relate to continuity of operations plans or disaster recovery plans? What changes had to be made to, if you want, traditional or standard communications plans and strategies to respond to this unprecedented and unexpected biological hazard? What special communications actions, tools, messages had to be employed and deployed to keep both the staff and the community well informed with accurate, reliable, and timely information, as well as to contain and to counter the spread of false and misleading information? And finally, what have we learned from a communicational perspective to be able to effectively respond to COVID-19, keeping both the staff and the general public safe, protected, and well informed? And so in search of answers to some of these questions and exploring this topic more broadly, we have put together a stellar panel composed of Matthew Schenk, who, as I told you before, he's the communications supervisor at Lancaster Countywide Communications 911 with many years of experience, and he's in the state of Pennsylvania. We also have Wilfrido Munoz. He's the Director of Communication of ECU 911, the Emergency and Safety Agency of Ecuador. We also have Tessa Seguer. She is the Marketing Communications Coordinator at Mission Critical Partners. And we also have with us today Marta Acevedo Silva. She is the Communications and Press Officer of ENA. And she's joined by her colleague, Rose Michael, who is a Knowledge Officer at ENA. As you can see, we have 5 panelists, but we will only have 4 presentations. Marta and Rose will be doing ENA's presentation together, and each presentation will take approximately between 10 to 15 minutes. If we can go to the next slide, Joel, please. Thank you. So the agenda is, thank you so much. So we will have those 4 presentations from 11:10 to 12:10, more or less. And then what we're going to do is we're going to open up the floor to get some reactions and some comments directly from some of the members of the emergency and safety community. I know that we have Giselle Mejia, Jaishima. We have people from the community that I think that will have something to say after listening to these 4 presentations. So the floor is going to be opened for you. You only have to request to speak, and your mic will be activated, and then you will need to activate your camera so that you can address the panelists directly. And we will also take questions from the general public through the chat icon on the Kudo platform. And to do that, what you're going to have to do is go to the messaging icon, the one that's on the right hand, the second icon from coming from the upward part of the platform downwards is the second icon. It's called messaging. And when you click on messaging, you're going to have 3 tabs. Please use the tab that says participants to leave there your questions, your comments. I'm going to make sure that I collect those. And for those who are watching us through our Facebook page, I hope that my colleague Ana Paula will be able to collect your questions and comments from that page, from the events page. You can just post your comments and your questions there, and my colleague Ana Paula will send those to me. And then, of course, when we get to the Q&A session, what I'll basically do is I'm going to pose the questions and share the comments with the panelists so that they can address those in the Q&A session. And finally, to close the event, we will have our acting director, the acting director of the Department of Public Security, to close the event with some final remarks. And so before I hand the floor over to our first panelist, who's going to be Matthew Schenk, I would like to mention that you're going to be able to download the materials from today's session. So for all of you who are participating through the Kuro platform, in order to access the materials, you have to go to the documents icon. Again, go to the right-hand side of the platform, and when you see the documents icon, just click on it, and you're going to find a list of the materials that we're going to be using throughout today's session. So you're going to be able to find the agenda in both English and Spanish. And Joel, if we can go to slide number 7 so that people can actually see the list of materials that we have. Perhaps you have the previous presentation. If you have the previous presentation, no worries at all. I can just basically go through or go over the materials that they're going to be able to find on this section of the platform. So you're going to be able to find the agenda. You're going to be able to find the bios. Unfortunately, I just mentioned their current positions, but in the bios, you're going to find more information about their academic and professional backgrounds. You're also going to find the presentations. Please be aware that from the 5 presentations, you're going to find 3 in their original language, in the language that they were prepared. And then we're going to find Matt's presentation and my presentation in English and Spanish. And in addition, please be aware that you're going to be able to take Matt Schenk's 5 takeaways, both in Spanish and in English. Mission Critical Partners has shared with us 2 related documents. You're going to be able to find COVID-19 tips for communicating with stakeholders during a crisis. This document is both in English and in Spanish, and I highly recommend that document. And it complements very well with the following document that's called a Crisis Communications Planning Guide. This is only currently in English, but please be aware that we are working on its Spanish translation, and it will be eventually available through the ESS community. And also, ENA has shared with us 2 supporting documents for today's session. And those documents are the impact of COVID-19 on PSAP activities. And the second document is called Recommendations for Emergency Services Organizations during the COVID-19 outbreak. And so the same exact set of documents will also be available through the ESS community. So for all of those who are watching us through Facebook, please be aware of that. And I'm going to ask Joel to stop sharing the presentation for just a quick moment. And I'm going to briefly demonstrate where our other participants, the ones that are listening to us through Facebook, can actually get access to the documents. So and I'm going to do this in both Spanish and English so that they can follow me. So you basically have to type in Google. For those who are English speakers, you have to type in Educational Portal of the Americas. So it's basically the title of where the community is hosted. You're going to see that on the screen, Educational Portal of the Americas. Just type that in. Once you're there, you have to go to Networks and Communities, and you have to look for DSP or GPS. You're going to click on that, and once you are on the GPS virtual communities, go to CES or ESS, click on that, it will turn blue, and then go all the way down to the last community of practice where it says ESS discussions. Click on that, and you will find all the materials, the ones that I just mentioned here on this community of practice. For all those who are listening to us on Facebook, I'm going to say this in Spanish. Básicamente tienen que tipear en Google Portal Educativo.
I'm repeating this now in Spanish for our Spanish listeners. Educational Portal of the Americas, Networks and Communities. You click on DSP-DPS. Then you go to SES ESS. And if you scroll all the way down, I'm sorry, there we go. At the last community of practice, just as I explained before, you click on that and you'll see all the materials that we are using today. I did this for those who are accompanying us via Facebook.
And we're going to open this panel with the intervention by Matt Schenk. So Matt, whenever you are ready, the floor is all yours, and I'm going to mute my mic so that you can make your intervention. Thank you, Matt.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me as a panelist on your program. And I have a lot of wonderful co-panelists here today with a lot of knowledge and experience. So please ask your questions. I'm taking my presentation today from a 911 supervisor that's working what we're doing today, what's actually happening at this moment in our 911 center and our dispatch center, and I'm sharing that information with you. So the threat of contracting COVID-19 by emergency responders is great and very real. Our PSAP, or 911 Center, has instituted a modification of our protocols for questioning callers who call into our center for fire, police, or ambulance response. The line of questioning has been derived from the information that the Center for Disease Control, the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, and the Department of Health has put out in regards to COVID. The fact that the virus can spread via respiratory droplets from one person to another is a great concern for our responders who physically may be in close proximity to the people who are requesting help. When an infected person coughs or sneezes, the virus spreads more readily. This is an immediate threat to EMS and police who may unknowingly be in contact with an infected person and need to protect themselves. When someone calls into our 911 center, we ask them if anyone has COVID symptoms, has been tested for COVID, has been sick, or not feeling well on the scene or in the home where the responders are responding to. We will then relay this information provided to us by the caller to the responding emergency services. We will even ask them to please put on a mask before the responders arrive. We follow this line of questioning for anyone that calls our center in which a response of an emergency responder is required. This helps to keep the responder safe no matter what the call is, and reminds the caller, who may be in a time of great crisis, that the responders will be taking precautions to protect themselves, and the caller should do as well. Our internal operations, obviously, an emergency call center cannot close its doors. The staff cannot work from home or suspend operations until the crisis passes. There needs to be a certain level of staffing to field emergency and non-emergency calls and dispatch emergency responders. Our agency employs about 100 people in our 911 center. We work 12-hour shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Our management staff continually monitors the information put out by our state government in order to provide accurate and timely information to our staff as well as following approved dispatch protocols. We keep ourselves informed and try and stay on top of the science for the disease. We push this information out to our staff by email or newspaper documents or something of that nature, so our staff knows where the information is coming from, that it's vetted information, it's valid information, and it's following the science of the disease. We have instituted a very aggressive cleaning and decontamination process for our facility. Our cleaning staff cleans daily and high-touch areas more often with disinfectant. Each call taker position has decontamination wipes and other decontamination supplies for the individual dispatcher to clean their area before they begin their shift and after they're completed with their shift. We have installed hand sanitizers throughout the building and opened all of the interior doors to eliminate the high-touch area of door handles, as well as increased air circulation in the dispatch room. We have increased the fresh airflow into the building from the outside via the HVAC system. Again, getting more fresh air into our dispatch room. We have allowed up to 2 weeks of paid time off if our staff is suspected of having COVID. They do have COVID, they've been exposed to a COVID patient, whatever. We have had 2 positive COVID cases in our center and multiple negative cases. For our positive cases, we have a professional COVID cleaning service that we have called to come in and disinfect our facility after we receive notification of the positive COVID cases. Our policy is if you go for a COVID test because you have concerns that you may have the illness, you may not come back to work until your results are available. If your results are negative, you may come back if you feel well. If your results are positive, you may not come back until your doctor advises that you may return. Public safety is obviously critical infrastructure and must be protected from any possible threat, even if that threat is carried by one of your own staff. We also have plans to abandon our facility while our main center is being professionally sanitized if the need arises. We have plans to split the staff and use our backup facility for a known healthy group of people while the other center is being cleaned. We have alternate facilities we can alternate facilities on a regular basis if we need to, so we can sanitize each facility during the rotation. We also have a plan to use office and administrative staff to fill in and work dispatch positions if there is a widespread outbreak within the dispatch staff. Every agency is different in assessing their potential crisis situation. We have a saying that we are all doing the same thing, just differently, and that is very true. What is the same concept, no matter who we are? How we go about executing our jobs, our assignments may be slightly different, but we are all protecting and working for the public. Your agency may be responsible for communications and taking calls from the public, dispatching calls for service. If so, our job is to ensure that we continue to do that no matter what the crisis. Your job may be responding to a crisis, providing protection of a business, a dignitary, or a group of people. It doesn't matter what your role is in public safety. You need to know what crisis may affect your ability to continually provide that service. It might be safe to say that none of us have professionally lived through, or have personally, we personally have not lived through a pandemic before, but here we are in the middle of one, trying to keep ourselves, our families, and our facility safe from the virus. We need to know how to do that correctly with correct and accurate information. We need to seek out the experts, even if we need to do that locally from a local doctor or a health agency that we trust to provide us with accurate information. Accurate information is the basis from which all critical decisions should be derived from in a crisis situation. Our challenge is to find that information and to keep it available to us during the length of the crisis. So as you can see, the key is knowledge and planning, using the elements and resources that you have access to. You may realize that you need to go out and acquire more resources or seek advice from experts that can look at your operation and provide you with suggestions to help you prepare and plan. The key to surviving a crisis situation is being prepared, training, practicing, and exercising your plan if possible, and to not keep that plan a secret within your agency. I prepared 5 takeaways or 5 points of emphasis in regards to my short discussion today. I would just like to run through them quickly, if I may. And again, it may help to generate some questions or thoughts. My number 1 point is have knowledge and understanding of the crisis. What is the crisis? What is causing it? How did it start? When will it end? Hopefully you have a plan in place already. You have training in regard to this crisis. And where do I find accurate and timely information? Again, you're looking for information for the length of the crisis, however long that crisis is. How would potentially affect the staff, the community, the facility, and your operations? Is it a physical threat like an earthquake, weather, civil unrest? Is it a medical threat like we're experiencing now, a pandemic, a sickness? Is a sickness local to your building, or is it a regional, local to your community? Number 3 is the timing of the crisis. The lengths, is it months to years, or is it short term, hours to days? Number 4, what must we do to have continuation of service yet protect the staff and the facility? You need to keep doing your job, but you need to keep your people safe. Your people are the key to your operation. So when you look at your staff, your staffing, allowance for staff to attend to their family and property. Your staff is not going to perform as you require them to or they need to when they're concerned about their family and their property. So what provisions might you have in place to allow them to attend to their family? Emergency staffing. Can you get staffing from somewhere else? From another means. If you're down 50% of your staff, where do you get more help? Possibly modification of services provided, a backup facility if your facility is not operational or it must be abandoned. Do you have support from local governments, the public, and emergency services? How are local emergency services impacted? Number 5, how do we come out of this as an agency? How when this is over, how are you coming out of this? How do you return to normal shifts and normal staffing? The big one, emotional support for your staff. Meet the needs of your staff. Your organization evolves, and the most important asset is your staff. How do you meet their needs? Rebuilding and repairing the facility and equipment and staff. You have emergency contacts that make you the priority if you need rebuilding and repair. Share your experiences with your staff in the region. I call it lessons learned. What did your agency do? What went well? What didn't go so well? If this ever happens again, what changes will you have in place? And develop an after-action report, again, putting in writing and documenting what went well, what didn't, and so forth. Again, this is a very short list of items to plan for as you prepare for a crisis in your agency. Make a list of all the potential crises that you could reasonably, hopefully never, but could expect to happen in your community. Write it down, share your plan, talk to your staff. So that's my presentation. Again, I hope you've gotten something out of it. Please ask any questions that you have. Thank you, Karen. So next.
Oh, thank you, Matt. That was great. Thank you for sharing your experience from Lancaster Countywide Communications 911 and some of the things that you had to do to adapt the agency, the staff, the facility to face COVID-19. I also think it was very important to set the framework of this discussion within this broader crisis planning and crisis management. And these 5 tips or 5 final takeaways or recommendations with regards to planning a crisis or key points towards planning a crisis and be prepared to face a crisis. I think that they were very, very useful and helpful. And I also think that they set very nice the framework to now go into more depth to one particular, if you want, aspect of crisis planning and crisis management, which is crisis communication. And so with that, I'm now going to turn the floor to Wilfrido Munoz so that he can tell us their experience working with crisis communication within Ecuador and particularly from the ECUM 911 agency. Wilfrido, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
You have to unmute, Wilfrido.
Presentations, but I guess this comes with virtual seminars and events.
Sí. Wilfrido, si podrías hacer refresh y volver a solicitar la palabra, por favor.
Wilfrido, maybe we could ask you to refresh. Wilfrido, you can either do a refresh or you can exit the session and re-enter. We're unfortunately unable to hear you. There's a little button in the upper right that says log out of meeting, and that should help. If not, you can exit the meeting and then come back in.
Problem here for all of those who are on the Kudo platform. If you go to documents, you're going to find Matt Schenk's presentation and his 5 takeaways, and the takeaways are both in Spanish and in English. So you can check those out and download them for those who are on the Kudo platform. And again, for those who are watching us through Facebook, remember that we have that material on the ESS community. So I don't know whether, Tessa, are you ready to, yes, would you be able to jump on now? Yes, okay, because.
Absolutely.
Great, Tessa, thank you. So let's go on now with Tessa from Mission Critical Partners. If you can share your presentation, and let's keep on going. Thank you.
Okay. So as Karen mentioned, my name is Tessa Sigworth, and I am from Mission Critical Partners. We support public safety agencies in their communications and operations, and I, as a marketing specialist, specialize in communications, and in this instance, working with our external stakeholders to develop crisis communications plans for how they are communicating with their stakeholders. Communicating with stakeholders is critical for any organization. It helps keep your stakeholders aware of what's going on within your agency, and especially during times of crisis, communications becomes even more important. And given today's current COVID-19 pandemic environment, communication is even more critical than ever before. While in the US, most areas are no longer in crisis mode, other countries around the world are beginning to experience a new wave of the virus, and as a result are returning to their early 2020 crisis mitigation efforts. In many instances, those efforts include open, honest communication with stakeholders around the virus and the organization's response to it. For public safety and emergency services in particular, this means helping stakeholders feel safe while ensuring them of your agency's ability to continue operating effectively and efficiently. Previously, my colleague Richard Gaston presented to this group on continuity of operations planning. And as he talked about, planning is key to the mitigation of the effects of a crisis. As part of that, agencies should be prepared to communicate early and often with all of their stakeholder groups. Why is that? Because communication helps stakeholders feel safe, it builds trust, prevents the spread of misinformation and the resulting panic among stakeholders, aligns internal and external messages, and helps protect an organization's reputation. As Richard discussed in his presentation, agencies face a variety of crises, both natural and man-made, every day. Planning is critical to the successful mitigation of those crises, whether it's from operational continuity, disaster recovery, and it includes how we communicate with our stakeholders along the way. Having a plan in place helps you to detail the initial steps in a crisis, define and assign a crisis team, and outline roles and responsibilities for the members of that crisis team, indicate who to contact, how to contact them, and when to contact them, provide message development guidance, and outline and execute training and education needed for team members to fulfill their responsibilities. The goal of planning ultimately is to have everything in place so that when a crisis does occur, you're prepared to communicate with your stakeholders. In this section, we'll discuss some of the basics and the most critical elements of your plan and how that plan will help you communicate with those stakeholders. It all starts with your team. When you're building your crisis communications team, it's important to have representation from all areas of your organization on board, including managers, directors, frontline telecommunicators, and field staff whenever possible, to ensure that communications are appropriate for both internal and external stakeholders across the board. It's also crucial that anyone that you intend to have on your crisis communications team be made aware of his or her role on that team, and upon completion of your crisis plan, adequately trained to execute on the responsibilities of that role. As I just mentioned, one of the key parts of building your team is identifying the roles and responsibilities of those team members. In doing this, you should take into consideration the team members' current job roles and their skills to find where they fit within your crisis communications team. For example, your organization's director or public information officer, should you have one, should be used in a public-facing role such as spokesperson. In this role, he or she would be responsible for delivering messages developed by the crisis team to stakeholders, either directly or through another stakeholder group, such as the media. This list outlines some additional roles you may wish to consider for your team and the responsibilities associated with each. You will need a crisis team leader whose responsibilities will include coordinating the response from the top down, developing, working with the team to develop messaging and overseeing the development of those messages, and scheduling team meetings. A crisis communications coordinator will help with the development of messaging for various stakeholder groups, supports media relations efforts, and works with the team leader to coordinate internal and external messaging and efforts. A media liaison coordinates with media to schedule press events and works with the spokesperson to develop media responses. A staff liaison would support delivery of messages to internal stakeholders and act as a point of contact for those stakeholders, questions, comments, concerns, etc. So once you've identified your team, how does it come together? The information should all be put together into a table and documented as part of your crisis communications plan. The example on this slide is an excerpt of the team outline from a plan developed in conjunction with the Emergency Communications Networks team at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. The table shows each role within that team, the specific responsibilities associated with that role, and the job title of the person on the crisis team who is assigned to that role. By assigning roles by job title rather than name, it helps to eliminate the need to update the plan every time someone changes job roles within the organization, joins the organization, leaves, or things of that nature. And your team, the roles may look slightly different, as may the responsibilities. They're not always a one-to-one match. Once your team has been established, you'll need to identify who your stakeholders are. This should encompass both internal and external audiences, and will help you understand how you need to develop your messaging. Depending on the situation that you are experiencing, all stakeholders may not require communication in some crisis situations. For example, if a staff member tests positive for COVID-19, that does not necessarily need to be communicated to the governor or elected officials unless they have been in physical contact with that person. In fact, unless you're experiencing a major outbreak, one COVID positive employee would likely only need to be communicated internally to those who have come into contact with that person. In another example, a cyber attack could take down an entire communications network, and that is grounds for wider spread communications to both internal and external audiences with messages regarding crisis impact and mitigation efforts, as well as alternate instructions for requesting emergency services. For example, things like using non-emergency numbers to request emergency assistance. An important thing to note here is that stakeholders and where they fit within the structure will vary based on your state country governance. For example, in Minnesota, PSAPs are the responsibility of the police or sheriff, and those audiences will need to be included as internal stakeholders higher up on the list. So they will need to be communicated with just as you would communicate with your PSAPs and your employees. The primary task of a crisis communications team is to communicate. This means developing messaging for various stakeholders and message delivery channels, as well as establishing a schedule for message delivery. Based on the crisis your agency is facing, this could mean communicating with 1 or 2 audiences, or it could mean a full-fledged communication effort with widespread outreach to all stakeholders on multiple platforms. When you're developing your messages, it's important to remember, who am I speaking to? What audience am I working with here? What are the key points that I need to make? You should identify 2 to 3 key messages that need to be delivered to that audience. How often do I need to communicate with this group? This is crisis dependent. It's virtually impossible to identify how frequently you'll need to communicate with an audience until you are in an active crisis. And where am I speaking to them? What platform am I using? Am I speaking to them via email? Am I developing a press release to distribute to the media? Am I speaking with them in person via a press conference or on social media with short social messages? In this example, from the message development exercise that we used with the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, we worked to develop canned messaging around a 911 service disruption that would be included as part of their communications plan. To start, we identified the issue, a 911 service disruption, who we were speaking to, the members of the local community, and what their concern might be, contacting 911 in the event of an emergency. We then identified 3 key messages that we wanted to make sure were delivered to that audience. In a crisis, each message will be supported by key points specific to that crisis, and messaging can then be tailored to suit the delivery platform. So what you see here are the 3 key messages: how to contact 911 during the outage, our apology for the inconvenience, and the message that we are working to identify the root cause and how to restore services. Each of these key messages will have support points that are specific to the crisis that you're experiencing in that moment. And the support points can be used across your messaging to support those key messages. You know, in a long form message, you'll use all 3 points. In a shorter form message, such as a tweet, you might just use 1. When it comes to developing the message for your plan, there are a couple of tried and true tips for message development and delivery that we do recommend. And that starts with including the development of canned or sample messages as part of the planning process. Essentially, what this does is help to expedite the message development process by giving your agency a chance to think clearly outside of a crisis. This helps to ensure more thorough, complete messaging that you can adjust and tweak to fit the crisis when you are in an active crisis. Establish a message review and approval process. This helps to ensure that messaging is reviewed several times, is appropriate for the audience, fits your agency's values, and is error-free. And you should only communicate when you have something to say. If you continue to put out messages simply to say something and they don't have anything of substance, it does leave room for stakeholders to make assumptions, and you may eventually lose control of the message to misinformation. It's also critically important to remember that establishing a delivery schedule in advance is not always possible. More often than not, when you communicate with a stakeholder group depends on a variety of factors specific to the crisis, including who you're talking to, what you have to say, the severity of the crisis, and how you're delivering the message. Here, we're presenting 2 examples of messaging focused for external stakeholders around 911 outages. The first is in Henrico County, Virginia, and the other is in North Central Texas. In both situations, a news release was developed giving basic details of the situation and delivered to their audiences. How the message itself was delivered, however, is varied by organization. In Henrico County, the police department issued a press release and then posted an image of the release with contact information directly to their own Facebook page to help reach the public and other external stakeholders using that platform. In Texas, the release was shared with the media, who in turn used the information to report out on the incident and used their own words to share the information with its own audience. In both instances, a previously created press release template was used to develop the messaging. That release was used as a guide, updated with the appropriate information, approved following the messaging protocols, and sent out to the appropriate stakeholders. In this case, Henrico County's Facebook audience and North Central Texas's media contacts. So once you've activated your team and started revising and releasing messages according to what's outlined in your plan, what happens next? Keep the lines of communication open. While your agency is actively in crisis, and even when the crisis has ended, it's important to let stakeholders know that the lines of communication are always open. Your agency can achieve this by identifying a point of contact or multiple points of contact to act as the voice of your agency within the community. Share your communications channels, including emails, phone numbers, and/or social media channels in all of your messages to your stakeholders. And encourage stakeholders to reach out to the points of contact with questions and establish a return communications timeline, i.e. within 12 hours, within 1 business day, etc. And continue to interact and engage with stakeholders when you're not in an active crisis. Engage with them on social media. Engage in the community in person when possible. In this current climate that we are in, this is not something that's always possible, but hopefully we're able to return to this soon. And once your crisis has cleared and you've established normal operations, it's important to review your response and the results that help you to make improvements to your crisis communications plan. This includes reconvening the crisis communication team and working with them to identify successes within the response. It's also important to discuss weaknesses and/or failures that occurred within your plan activation and leverage the results of this discussion to make improvements to the plan. Once you've updated the plan, you should socialize the updates throughout your communications team, and as a group, accept the plan revisions and place the new plan on servers and as your current plan. Now, before I turn things over, I'd like to quickly recap some of the most critical points that we've discussed today. The first, planning is key. Advanced planning is essential to a successful crisis communications effort. Having a plan in place, whether as part of your continuity of operations and disaster recovery plan, or as a standalone communications plan, can help to mitigate a crisis and communicate effectively during that crisis. Build an effective team. You can do this by including members from different departments and roles within your organization, and clearly defining each role within the crisis communications team and the responsibilities that fall within that role. Develop clear messages. Identify who you're talking to, where you're talking to them, and how often you need to talk with them. From there, you can use pre-developed canned or sample messages as a platform to create crisis-specific messages that deliver your message effectively and concisely. Don't over-communicate. Maintain control of the message by only communicating with stakeholders when you have something to say, i.e., when there is an update available or a new audience to communicate with. Overwhelming your audience with messages that do not say anything of substance can enable them to draw their own conclusions and make assumptions on the circumstances of the crisis and how the crisis is impacting your organization. Encourage incoming communications. Keep the lines of communication open and encourage stakeholders to reach out to identified points of contact with questions, comments, and concerns. And finally, as review and improve. As part of your crisis, post-crisis review response, as Matt mentioned in his presentation, this is a critical part of the crisis communication and crisis management process. Evaluate your response and make adjustments or improvements to your plan. Your plan is a living document that is constantly evolving to meet your stakeholders and your organization's needs. thank you for your time. We will begin taking questions shortly. If you have any questions or if there's anything from today's presentation that you would like more information about, please feel free to reach out to me directly.
Great, Tessa, that was amazing, super interesting. And as you can see from Matt's and Tessa's presentation, one of the linking points was the issue of planning, how important it is to plan. And whereas Matt gave us like a general framework towards crisis planning and crisis management, Tessa, you were able to kind of tune it very specifically to the issue of planning and crisis, and you were able to give us really very specific steps and decisions that have to be taken in order to, if you want, control or react to crisis from a communicational perspective. So thank you for that. That was very useful. And remember that Tessa's presentation, as well as the tips, the tips for communicating with stakeholders during a crisis and crisis communications planning guide, those two documents plus a presentation are on the documents section of the Kudo platform, as well as on the ESS community, as I previously showed you. So the fact that Wilfrido presentation didn't come second place, I think it worked kind of nice because now we're going to leave the US and we're going to go into Ecuador. And because of what I've seen from Wilfrido's presentation, this is more like a case study, right? So we've had like the crisis planning, the crisis management, how to react to one specific crisis, which is one created by a biological hazard. We had Tessa specifically telling us what steps or decisions or actions need to be taken to prepare an emergency and safety agency from a communicational perspective. And now we're going to go to Ecuador to kind of hear a specific case study of what to do from a communicational perspective to face different types of crises, including a crisis created by a pandemic such as COVID-19. So Wilfrido, the floor is all yours, and hopefully this time we can listen. Yeah?
Hola Karen, ahora sí.
Hello, Karen. Is everything okay now? Well, I would like to extend my greetings to you, to all of the panelists, and I wanted to thank the OAS for this discussion, which helps to build on the emergency systems and allows us to share some ideas about communications in the case of a crisis or an emergency, for example, now in the midst of this COVID-19 pandemic. I will share my presentation with you, which provides certain details, many of which coincide with what Matt has already spoken about, as well as what Tessa shared. I wanted to talk more than about the COVID-19 crisis. I wanted to refer to high impact events. So again, as I was saying, I want to talk about high impact events and speak very briefly about what we call the post-truth and fake news. Why do we do that? Unfortunately, we're not seeing your presentation, Wilfrido. I have it up on my screen, and I was hoping that you were all seeing. Can you not see it? Why don't you send it directly to Joelle, and Joelle can put it up on the screen? Yes, and sorry, Joelle, for asking you to do that. We had it already. Yeah, but this always happens. We test the microphones, we test the presentations, we test the cameras, and something always goes wrong. Luckily, we have a backup of your presentation, so Joelle will be able to share it. In any case, while Joel is getting that presentation up on the screen, I wanted to state that I want to speak more about high impact events than the healthcare crisis. And I wanted to talk about the post-truth and fake news. This photo that you see is the video monitoring room in ECHO 911. In terms of high impact events, in terms of the post-truth, that is a distortion of reality that is done deliberately. There is a German author, Nietzsche, who stated that everything is true and nothing's true. Even more so when there are problems. Everyone's right, but nobody's right. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of Ecuador's 911 system and how we respond to emergencies. In the next slide, Joelle, if you could advance the slide, please. I wanted to talk about communication management during emergencies. It's like a living being. It's one that evolves, it progresses, it's constantly changing. Therefore, the best planning in terms of communication is one that already has a defined system, one that's already planned. How do we manage information during emergencies? How do we work with the media? The participants in the previous, those who came before me were talking about things that we have not experienced in Ecuador. But so how do we manage communication in crisis? It's to keep active. We don't quiet down the institution. You have to have representatives of the institution. Sometimes you can't represent just yourselves. These are emergencies. We have to publish up-to-date information. We have to create calm in the community. And what was saying Tessa, how can we remain impartial in terms of the information we're sharing, understanding that this is information regarding an emergency? How can we provide timely responses to our users? And what I mean by this is the media. It's people who are experiencing the emergency, the authorities who need figures so that they can provide a message to the community. How do we come up with technical content? And I really want to underscore this. So these are technical content that are aligned with management, but they are also separate from political positions, which can cause a great deal of harm. What to say, how to say it, when to say it, why, and to whom. One of the major challenges when it comes to communication is to have a team of communicators that's comprehensive, who have what we call 360-degree abilities, where there is synergy and certain initiative to generate quality content. So it's not just quality, but there also has to be solidarity, partnership. We can be very apathetic sometimes when we're addressing. So the communications team is key when it comes to providing communication in the case of an emergency. A little bit later, I will share some high impact cases that we've dealt with in Ecuador. So next slide, please. When we talk about emergency services, very often we ask ourselves, how does an emergency service operate, like in Ecuador, ECHO 911? And this is when critical thinking sometimes falls to the wayside, when there is a hyper communication and hyper information in a society. People will follow what's going on in the United States and Mexico and China, wherever. So this idea of having a highly informed society isn't necessarily a good thing, because sometimes it's based on conjecture, and that comes back to us in the service. People will say, you just said X, but in the United States or in X country, they've said X, Y, or Z thing about a vaccine. And so that's why we think that the critical thinking on the part of the communicator when issuing a message has to be clear and very precise. I'm going to give you 3 examples of high impact events in Ecuador. The first one, so obviously, first we have the 2020 pandemic, the one we're experiencing now. But we had 2 prior events. One was an earthquake in Ecuador in 2016, and then we had the indigenous protests in Ecuador in 2019. Many of the panelists and many of those who are joining us in this discussion, I'm sure will have heard about these events in Ecuador. So let's go to the first one, the 2016 earthquake. Just to provide some background, and this is where I agree with Matthew, when the 2016 earthquake happened, you can see this picture that captures a little bit of what happened. This is in Manatí. So we activated all communications personnel. And when I say everyone, I'm talking about a country with a population of 15 million people, which has one communicator per territory, and they work from a central location. But we really aren't aware of what's happening in other regions. So this was an event that had a huge impact nationally. So ECO 911 became the logistics and operations center for coordinating all actions to tackle the crisis. So what did we have to do? We had to come up with communications materials and activate social networks, spokespersons. We had to have press releases, and those needed to be very accurate. In the 2016 earthquake, we were providing information about everything that was happening. So how many people had been affected, the magnitude of the earthquake, what cities had been impacted, what were the consequences, and potential solutions. This is where I reiterate what I was saying at the start of my talk, is that communication during crisis require planning, prior planning. Then we had the October protests. You will see an image of this on your screen momentarily. In 2019, October of 2019, we saw protests nationwide in Ecuador. 13 days that were socially, politically very impactful. Cities were destroyed, and there was a mix between vandalism and looting and protests. So the ECO 911 system had to act. We had to look at we had to communicate what roads were open, what roads were closed. We did this through social networks. We were communicating the reality in real time, but fake news was saying that many of these roads had been closed, and they provided images and pictures from other years, from other cities that weren't even in Ecuador. So what we have to do was standardize criteria and then provide a response. What were our key messages for deterrence? We had video cameras that for many years have saved people's lives and prevented suicides and prevented thousands of crimes. These street cameras were being destroyed by the protesters. And we communicated this to the people. we asked the protesters to allow emergency vehicles to get through. And then just a few days after the social protests concluded, we put together a campaign which was called, and it still exists, called Ecuador Renace, which is Ecuador is Reborn. This was not just about the events that had happened. We took pictures of a sunrise. We showed cities that were back to normal. So in a crisis, you have to react depending on the specific crisis. And now, in the case of COVID-19, this pandemic, starting back in March and up until now, has had serious repercussions in the country. Currently in Ecuador, we have 162,000 cases of COVID-19. And according to our figures, approximately 12,000 dead. Between March and April, the impact of the pandemic in cities like Guayaquil was incredible. Cities like Guayaquil, which are among the most important commercial cities in Ecuador, their hospitals were about to collapse. Emergency lines had completely collapsed. But this was just another case study, as Karen was saying. So we had to think, what are we going to say at a time when the community has a very clear idea of what's happening in Ecuador? So what did we do? We implemented security measures and we communicated those to the community. Is Ecuador prepared for a confluence of emergencies like we saw in the second meeting here at the OAS? We saw the deaths of people who had COVID or people catching COVID, but other problems came up. Domestic violence rates began to increase, and very significantly, suicides as well. But along the way, we found an interesting opportunity for communicating with the public. We had figures from ICU 911, which we called human incivility. Through these cameras, we started to see groups of people getting together, and this was directly associated with the number of people with COVID or who had died. So you saw people gathering in the streets or protests. All of these figures, or we saw parties, these were captured by security cameras, and we shared it with the public through the media. The idea was to prevent the future spread of the disease. In the case of pandemic, we continue to tell the public to avoid gatherings, to avoid parties, to avoid crowds in the street. This gave us certain credibility as an institution vis-a-vis the authorities to make decisions about what to do. Should they open the schools? Should they keep them closed? What about parks? What about other facilities? ECU 911 throughout the pandemic has kept working, and we have a campaign, and it says, the name of our campaign is Seguimos de Pie. We're still up and running. We're still on our feet. There is a platform, a tool that has been accepted by ECU 911. It's called Distancia 2, which measures the gatherings and crowds of people. The idea was to reopen beaches or tourism sites for economic recovery. As you can see, I'm almost done. So if we could just go to the next slide. With these phenomena, with these cases that we've experienced in Ecuador, please let me leave you with a final thought. What is happening with climate change? For decades, the scientific community has been warning about global warming and has provided data and studies. But now there is an alternative post-truth that says climate change is not so serious. And what's more, it's caused by natural phenomenon. And you think, what's easier to believe? This is referring to the post-truth. So lessons learned, just to close out my presentation. In terms of lessons learned, we believe that you have to standardize and communications policies on specific points. All institutions of the government should be speaking the same language. Don't respond to the trolls. Always recognize the management model and share it with the public. Have a single message, a unified message. Take part in these types of discussions that allow us to share ideas. Continue to feed into chats. In Latin America, we use these a lot. WhatsApp networks with reporters, with journalists, and the community, as well as public relations in high-level television programs. Create graphic materials and produce technical content that are aligned with management, but these always need to be separate from political positions. And this is why I say, as I wrap up, the Canadian Matt Lucan, who a few years ago said that the media is the message. We have to have a broad relationship with the community, but the channels that we have for communicating messages are the media in terms of strategic messaging. And with this, I will conclude my participation, and I will be happy to respond to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilfrido. That was really interesting to be able to delve into one specific case study, if you want, and this this route or this path in which you took us, analyzing different types of emergencies or threats or hazards, and how from ECU 911 you reacted from a communicational perspective. So that was very enlightening. And again, despite the fact that we are going to be facing different kinds of emergencies or different kinds of hazards and threats, we're going to have to react for each of them in a different way. But that the way that we react, or the way that we respond, needs to be as planned as possible. And again, this is planification is the word that I also heard in Wilfrido's presentation. And two additional points that are also linked to what Tessa was saying, the fact that it's important to have a group of people, not a group, a team. It's not just a group, it's a team of people working specifically on the communicational aspect of a crisis. And then the fact that if you're working with a communications plan, that communications plan, and that's something, Tessa, that you also said in your intervention, it needs to be a live document. It needs to be a document that is constantly adapting and changing and improving to have an agency better prepared to face other crises. And the other point that I would also like to stress from Wilfrido's presentation, that Tessa, you also touched upon this in your presentation, is the fact that we need to kind of standardize the same message, and we don't have to come up with contradictory messages. And I think it's really important to think like solving mechanisms, what to do when you have contradictory messages from the same agency or from different state institutions. So think about that, no? Think about what internal mechanisms and interagency mechanisms we have to put in place when we have contradictory messaging. And so now I'm gonna stop talking, and having kind of done an overview from a communicational perspective, taking into consideration the US and the Ecuador, what they are doing, what emergency and safety agencies are doing to face this specific biological hazard or this crisis created by the COVID-19 pandemic in the US and in Ecuador. We're going to now jump to Europe, and we're going to now listen from Marta Acevedo Silva and Rose Michael from ENA, and trying to better understand what they have been seeing from a communicational perspective in emergency and safety agencies in Europe. So the floor is all yours, ladies. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hola a todos. I will share my screen. Let me know if you can see the presentation. Okay, so my name is Marta Acevedo Silva, and I'm the Communications and Press Officer at ENA, the European Emergency Number Association. And today, with my colleague Rose Michael, we'll present you ENA's perspective on emergency communications during the COVID-19 outbreak. Our presentation will focus mainly on the first months of the pandemic here in Europe, as this was one of the most challenging times for emergency services professionals. So this is our table of contents. We will talk first about the impact of COVID-19 on emergency call centers. Then we will share with you some best practices for emergency communications. We also will share some actions on how to counter misinformation and disinformation. And finally, we'll be talking about public warning. So first, I think we can all agree that maintaining operational and resilient emergency communications is imperative during a pandemic response like COVID-19, not only for public safety organizations, but also for the community well-being. And before we understand the strategies that were put in place, it was important for us to understand the impact of COVID-19 on emergency call centers, since the pandemic was and is a real and immediate threat for the ability of the centers to operate efficiently. So what were the big problems that emerged? We conducted a survey and some exploratory interviews to different European PSAPs, public safety answering points. And one of the most prominent problems was, of course, the increase in the volume of emergency calls. And this was visible especially in regions and countries most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, as the Lombardy region in Italy. This was the epicenter of Europe's initial coronavirus outbreak, or the Rioja region in Spain that was also extremely affected. Here in the graphic, you can also see a big increase in the volume of calls in Croatia. This was due to the fact that in the period under analysis, there was a major earthquake in Zagreb. And of course, natural disasters can also generate an influx in emergency calls because people tend to be more concerned. So the increase in the number of calls was seen in key moments in the countries, like the announcement of state of emergency, the announcement of lockdown measures, or the announcement of the first case of a person with COVID-19 in the country. So in these initial moments of tensions, where people were still very concerned and didn't know how to act, however, it's important to notice that the level of calls was not in proportion to the level of risk, that is, with the development of COVID-19 in the countries, which means that it's particularly important for citizens to be well informed, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, to prevent the emergency lines from becoming saturated. So this increase in the number of calls has led to some internal adjustments, and the question that we raised was how PSAPs were reorganized. And this led us to see some trends. The first one was more at the level of operation policies, with the change of protocols and procedures. With the huge amount and the huge traffic of people calling emergency lines, it was important to rethink the PSAP structures to ensure that people with time-dependent pathologies were also able to receive help. For example, in the Lombardy region in Italy, the 112 PSAP received an average of 14,000 calls per day. And with COVID, the number of calls increased 5 times this amount. With a new approach and a new strategy in place at the PSAP and EMS dispatch PSAP, the situation has improved greatly, from a call waiting time of 10 minutes to 12 seconds, compared to the nominal 5 seconds waiting time before COVID-19. This proves that systems like 112 can indeed endure the pressure even in these severe cases. Other measure that was implemented was, of course, the infection and prevention and control practices for routine activities, as for example, access to PPE, personal protective equipment for healthcare personnel. It was also important to increase the capacity of call centers. This was a trend, I dare to say, that was implemented in all European countries and also worldwide. Medicine students, former call takers, also call takers from other services were some of the volunteers that reinforce emergency lines. When it comes to interagency cooperation, the most important thing is to be synchronized. A good example was seen in Romania, where the COVID-19 information helpline is the collaboration between services, since it's operated by the National Institute of Public Health, the Ministry of Health, the Special Telecommunication Service, and during night shifts, the Ministry of Defense staffs the lines. Of course, one of the other big problems, as my colleagues also here in this today said, is disinformation and misinformation. It's a challenge not only for emergency professionals, but also for emergency communications. And especially we saw with this crisis an unprecedented amount of disinformation. COVID-19 is the first pandemic in history in which technology and social media are being used on a massive scale. And with that, there is also a great risk. Misinformation can cost lives and jeopardize the measures to control the pandemic. Here in the slide, you can see some examples. For example, in Czechia, the line congestion increased after the spread of rumors that the helpline was answered by epidemiologists. In the UK, there were rumors that the outbreak was caused by 5G. Also here in Belgium, there was some false calls false message on WhatsApp from a nurse that led to a run on supermarkets. So there's just some few examples of the danger of that disinformation is for public health. Now I'll give the floor to my colleague Rose. Michael will share with you some best practices for communication strategies.
Thank you, Marta. Yes, so now we understand better the problems that the emergency organizations were facing. We're going to now look to the best practices and lessons learned for communication. So we can go to the next slide, please. So the first lesson that we'd like to share is the importance of adaptability. So obviously in terms of the pandemic, this was very important because it was not always obvious how the situation would progress. So we saw in various countries very good examples of adapting communication strategies and the way that the public communicated with the authorities. For instance, in contacting victims of domestic violence. So it became quite clear that the use of the traditional methods to contact the authorities, such as specific helplines for these victims, it no longer became very appropriate, considering that when there was lockdown measures introduced, these people were often forced into close proximity with their abusers. So the authorities needed to act very quickly in order to be able to communicate with these victims and have them also be able to request help from the authorities. So we saw in several countries, for instance, in France and in Spain, we saw a campaign where victims could go to the pharmacy and use a code word, which would then alert the pharmacist to call 112. We also saw the implementation of technologies that weren't used before in that country. For instance, a chatbot was introduced by an NGO in the UK, in other countries the use of apps. And this gave new methods for victims to communicate with the authorities. In another example we could use, if we think about Malta, there were concerns here, as in many countries, that the pandemic would also have mental health impacts on the population. So there were efforts there to launch a campaign, an awareness campaign called You Are Not Alone. And this was used to also highlight a new number, 1772, that was announced during the pandemic for people to call with mental health concerns. And thanks to this campaign, during the first week of this number being active, there were 500 calls of people asking for help using this service. So this brings us also onto the point of accessibility, and it's extremely important that all communications are accessible for persons with disabilities. We have a few important examples from Europe. For instance, in Italy, the national public broadcaster RAI, they gave a TV spot for the Ministry of Health, and this spot was also transmitted using sign language. In France, there was a specific web page for persons with disabilities to access information on COVID. And in Iceland, the COVID-19 help page on the internet could also be read aloud for people that use this service. We also have to think about communicating in different languages, particularly in the context of the pandemic, because a lot of the measures that were introduced, they really rely on all of the population understanding these strategies that are being used. So for instance, in Estonia, the helpline for COVID-19 was answered in English as well as Estonian and Russian in order to be able to provide information to different sectors of the population. As Marta mentioned, cooperation between services, so internal communication between services was very important. For instance, where we saw that in certain countries there was an increase in calls to emergency medical services, but a decrease in some countries for fire and rescue services and police services. So in countries like France, in some departments, we saw fire and rescue services taking calls for the emergency medical services. So this internal cooperation and communication was very important. And we can have the next slide, please. So key to understand and to remember is that all the messages need to be simple, clear, timely, and coherent. Probably one of the most difficult things to do during the pandemic is to keep coherency. As plans may change, you don't know how the situation will progress. This is why we think it's extremely important that we learn from other countries. We see what was useful, what was successful in different countries and what was not, so that the plans can stay as stable as possible and the message can stay as coherent as possible to the public. Also, it's worth mentioning that we recently at ENA had a talk by Dr. Chris Cocking, who is an expert in crowd psychology, and he was explaining some of the difference in messaging in the United Kingdom during the pandemic. So he explained that this began with a very clear, coherent message: stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. And this later spread to a slightly less clear message of stay alert, control the virus, save lives. So you hear that the message of the action that needs to be taken by the public was not as clear in the second. And this slogan was also not adopted by all of the devolved governments in the United Kingdom. So this led to inconsistency within the United Kingdom. Also worth mentioning that for coherency and consistency, when a new strategy such as non-emergency numbers are introduced, which did prove very useful in several European countries, there needs to be enough information online, for instance, through websites, apps, through the use of infographics, so people really understand how these numbers should be used properly. We can go to the next slide. So now, as we've talked a bit about misinformation and disinformation, it's important to know that all these methods that we've mentioned can help to counter false information, but to remember that the emergency organizations themselves can also help to stop the spread of false information. And this was exactly what happened in Lille in France, when the emergency medical services publicly announced that there was false information being spread about their organization. In Croatia, we also see the government agencies working alongside with the media. So at the beginning of the pandemic, the government agencies issued a warning, a strong warning to the online media that they should only publish official statistics and information during the pandemic. And a few weeks ago, they thanked them for their cooperation, as the majority have done so. Also, as we know, online platforms play a very important role in spreading false information. Here at ENA, we actually did a project with Twitter during this first wave over in Europe, where we had a verification project which allowed official emergency organizations to apply for their organization to have the blue badge. So using this project, we were able to give these organizations the visibility so that the public knew that this was where they could access reliable information. And the next slide, please, Marta. So the main thing to just remember about false information is that it thrives in situations of panic or insecurity. So it's key to spread only factual and reliable information, to give concise and regular updates, and of course to reach as much of the population as possible. And this leads us on now to Marta's discussion of public policy.
Okay, so one of the ways for public authorities to also communicate with citizens and to prevent misinformation and disinformation is through effective public warning systems. Advanced public warning systems and technologies can allow to more geo-target alerts and interaction with the population, and it can also help some authorities to get better situational awareness of a situation. For example, how many people are located in a certain area, or how many nationals are still located abroad. Here are some examples of public warning systems based on telephony that were used during COVID-19 outbreak. For example, the Netherlands, Greece, and Romania, they used cell broadcast message, and France, Portugal, and Denmark, nationwide SMSs were sent, and Germany and Austria, they have their own public warning apps that are used locally. However, it's important to say that public warning systems are not only through mobile networks. There are countless ways to communicate with the population, for example, through TV, radios, websites, social media, billboards, dedicated apps. And there is also a technique that is called multi-channel public warning. That is the combination of several technologies, and this can be very, very effective way to communicate with the population. And finally, we have one last question, is how to ensure availability and continuity of critical communication services. As we all know, communication is essential when a crisis hits. And in our ideal world, we have our communication plan and we roll it out. But unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world. And I think COVID-19 proved all of us and was a challenge and is a challenge still to all of us and took us all by surprise. That's why it's so important to have communication managers to ensure communication across varied platforms and different channels, to adapt message quickly, to create effective messages, to move target audiences toward actions to protect families, communities, and nations. So what do we recommend from our research? First of all is screen. Ensure monitoring and maintaining of systems. Make also sure that you have a robust cybersecurity system. Many hackers are taking advantage of the pandemic to disrupt patients' services, for example. Plan. Ensure that emergency centers has your emergency center has, for example, a plan to respond to outages, that you have a backup center, reevaluate existing protocols, reevaluate also your contingency plans, survey needs, also sanitation measures, as for example, ask your employees to self-monitor their symptoms, and replan. Replan is evaluate all over again and have the ability to adapt your plan as the threat evolves. In all these phases, communication is key, not only internally and externally, and especially to keep the population well informed, because we believe that an informed population is a safer population. So that's all from our side. Thank you a lot.
Oh, thank you so much, both Marta and Rose, for that presentation, for sharing with us that general overview of how emergency and safety agencies in Europe are responding to COVID-19 from a communicational perspective. And I would like to stress the fact that Rose was talking how messages need to be simple, clear, timely, and coherent. And I would like to add to that list what Tessa was saying, that we should try not to overwhelm the population, right? Because I think that also we run the risk of saturating and kind of fatiguing people with so much information, particularly about COVID-19. And I think also, Marta, Rose, when you talked about the fact of trying to keep a message coherent and consistent, particularly when we are getting to know this virus. It's a new kind of virus. Doctors and epidemiologists are constantly coming up with new information about the virus, and so sometimes it's kind of difficult to keep that message coherent and consistent because we are learning as we go along. And I think that this is important because when people see that we are changing our message, that can kind of erode the trust that the institution has. And of course, when not of course, but when you have institutions that people don't believe in, then kind of trying to manage a crisis becomes more difficult when people don't trust the institutions that are leading the response to that crisis. So I think that's also kind of a tricky point. And then I want to also thank you both for addressing more in depth this some of the measures or actions that can be taken to counter misinformation and disinformation, and also Marta for bringing to the discussion the use of a very particular tool or instrument such as public warning systems as a way to disseminate technical information, accurate information, reliable information through multi-channels in a very timely manner. So having said that, I'm going to try to open up the floor just in case our colleagues from the emergency and safety community are willing to react, to comment, to share their experiences. I know that Giselle Mejia from Costa Rica's emergency system is here. So Giselle, if you want to make a comment, this is the time to do it. We also have Gilles Fábrega, who's the director of SUME of Panama. We also have Yanshima from Trinidad. If any of you would like to make a comment, react to what you heard, share your experience from a communicational perspective, please request to speak so that we can activate your mic. There is Giselle, Joel, so if you can, perfect. There we go. Giselle, now you have to activate your mic and your camera so that we can see and eventually also listen to your question, hear your question. No? The panelist, Giselle Mejia, she's the executive director of Costa Rica's Emergency and Safety 911 Agency. Giselle, hay que activar el micrófono.
¿Me escuchan? Are you able to hear me now? Good afternoon, everyone. It was really a pleasure to hear these quality presentation. The mastery of the topic is astounding. And I wanted to thank you, Karen, and the OAS, because these opportunities help us to reach optimum levels in terms of development. Karen, are you all hearing me? Yes, Giselle, we're hearing you perfectly. We perhaps have made great efforts in the context of the pandemic, as we heard, that have challenged all of our limits. In Costa Rica, we have an internal work team that was able to do a daily assessment of everything we were doing. And we saw about 60% higher calls, double number of calls, and there were days where we were getting more than 25,000, 18,000 calls per day, which was overwhelming our capacity that in 2019 was approximately 12,000 calls per day. What we tried to do was remain calm. For me, what has been most important in Costa Rica is this work team tried to instill calm in everyone so that they could provide accurate information. Even those who had caught COVID-19, they were constantly monitored, and this helped them to get back to work once their quarantine time was over. We tried to organize things better. So my question for all of you is, in so much time of so much work, there's been time to actually think about your communications plans, because honestly, in Costa Rica, the challenge is to just deal with the day-to-day. We need to mature in terms of where we are in the process, but prior to and after the pandemic, we'll be able to pay attention to this. Wilfredo's presentation was excellent. Wilfrido in Ecuador, we consider you our brothers and sisters. And I was really struck by what you were saying, because it's so difficult when you have crisis after crisis that are always, many cases have a political side to them, but we want to provide high quality information and data that will make things clear to the public as to how they can use the 911 service, for example. But I have learned so much. And Karen, I just wanted to note that in terms of the OAS's virtual group, our efforts, what we need to do is incorporate these lessons learned. Hopefully this will be a roadmap for all of the agencies working with this service that is so important to the public, which is 911. So I wanted to extend a warm embrace to all of you.
Of asking the panelists to kind of summarize into 5 tips or 5 recommendations or 5 takeaways was a little bit to start building this paper with lessons learned and recommendations for the agencies in the Americas to kind of navigate this crisis from a communicational perspective. And I would then like to ask panelists whether they have something to respond to Giselle's intervention. And she's basically asking if you have any experience or you have any thoughts about how to go about evaluating either the communication plan or either the communication actions or tools. And I guess Matt and Tessa, you both touched upon this issue of evaluating, and Marta, you also talked about reevaluating, right? So I don't know whether an after-action review process would be kind of fit to do this, or how are you imagining this process of evaluating and reevaluating and improving either the communication plan or the communication actions? I don't know if you want to start, Matt.
To me, the easiest and best way to do this is through tabletop exercises, where you bring your key players together in a morning or an afternoon or an all-day event, whatever works for you, and you just run through different scenarios of you know, a crisis situation, and then how your staff is going to react, and you capture this on paper, and you just keep reevaluating. And if you do this once a year, once every 6 months, whatever is appropriate, you'll keep finding holes in your plan or things that could be done better in your plan. And then if you want to take it another step, maybe you bring in people from your neighboring facility, your neighboring 911 center, and have them sit in and listen. And maybe they can find areas that you can improve. It's hard in a 911 center or an emergency call center to actually do a real live exercise. So tabletop is the next best to walk through your processes.
Great, thank you. Tessa, anything else to add?
Sure. Yeah, I agree 100% with everything that Matt said. Tabletop exercises and training are critical to making sure that your plans, whether it's continuity of operations or disaster recovery or crisis communications, are all functioning the way that they should be. But it's also important, and Matt touched on this in his presentation as well, that at the conclusion of a crisis or situation where you've had to activate one or more of your plans, that you conduct an after-action report. You reconvene that team, you discuss what you've done, and you try to identify where there might be some weaknesses within your plans and try to rectify those. And then once you've changed the plan and updated it, go through those training and tabletop exercises again.
Okay, great, Tessa, thank you. And Wilfrido, are you planning on running any kind of evaluation process? to the communications actions that you have implemented in ECU 911? And if so, well, how are you planning on evaluating those actions?
Your microphone is still muted. Uh-oh.
Joel is going to try to help Wilfrido. I don't know, Rose and Marta, if you can add anything to any thoughts of how to go about evaluating particularly communication plans or strategies or actions. If you've already experienced any of these exercises in Europe, and if so, what can you share with colleagues here in the Americas? Yes, Rose or Marta.
I don't know if you want to go.
No, you go, Marta.
No, I think we agree with all the other panelists, and it's quite important. Especially, we saw that some more at the PSAP levels that they were also monitoring social media. But of course, this is a very new, so it's very difficult to now proceed how it will be in the future. So I guess now that we are approaching, unfortunately, a second wave, will be the time to see if effectively the plans will.
And I think just one thing that we could add is maybe just to not be afraid to be critical of what we've done before. So if you really see that something has not worked, to not be afraid to admit that this hasn't worked so that we can progress, because this is how we're learning from other countries, from ourselves. I think, yeah.
That's a really wise and very realistic comment, Rose. Thank you. And I don't know, Wilfrido, did they fix your mic? Are you going to be able to say something about how you're planning on evaluating your communication?
Ahora sí, yo les escucho perfecto.
Yes, I can hear you all perfectly now. I completely agree with the panelists in as much as in Ecuador, we put together our communications plan at the end of the year. About 1 or 2 months before the end of the year, we come up with our communication plans and we start to project them into the future. But as we were taken by surprise by the pandemic, clearly we had to adapt the actions to the pandemic. I think all of those here are part of a generation that never even dreamed we would be up against something like COVID-19, even less so in terms of communication. So how do you manage strategic communications? But when the pandemic came, we were caught completely off guard. So we need to come up with a matrix, like Tessa was saying, wherein we can devise our overall messages to the public, but then we can adapt them to these high impact episodes. COVID-19 pandemic, case in point, where if the public is going to be communicating through social networks or through traditional media, or is the communication coming from the authorities? The great challenge that we see in these discussions, it's not just about maintaining a communication strategy, it's to have very clear messages that are completely divorced from politics, and also preventive messages, because sometimes we're just talking about the emergency, but in those messages, we're not trying to bring calm to the public. So the great challenge for communicators is to strike a balance in the messages where we can talk about the emergency, but try to sow calm in the public.
And I think it's very important. And we discussed about this, the content of the messaging. You're always usually, particularly from emergency and safety agencies, you're usually reacting to crisis, but it's also important to stress the importance of including preventive messages into our strategy. And because, as Rose was saying, right, fear usually is the right terrain for misinformation and disinformation to spread. So I also think it's really important, this idea to bring calm, to bring peace to the population through the messaging. And I think it's also important, and I don't know whether, because I don't come from the communications area, but whether you work with metrics in order to understand how successful your plan or your strategy was. And if you could briefly comment on, I mean, if you use metrics in order to kind of measure the impact or of the strategy, of the plan, or more specifically, the success of specific actions that you took from a communicational perspective. Do you use metrics? And if you could give some examples of the metrics that we could use, particularly tailored to this present situation. And I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. No?
I can jump in on this one. There are a lot of different metrics that you can use when you're evaluating the results of your outgoing communications. It's not a specific to COVID situation, but it is the result of a 911 outage in North Central Texas. We worked with them to pool media coverage of the outage. We used some tools to look at the results of Twitter and Facebook posts, the reach there, and kind of gave them some quantifiable data in terms of what portion of their population they were able to reach. And we were able to, by looking at the different types of media, multilingual, identify some different subsets within those external stakeholder audiences that they were able to reach. So those are fairly easy things to do. You can find the circulation of publications, the viewership of television channels with a pretty quick Google search. And if you're running a business page on Facebook, you can look in your analytics and see how many people a post reached and how many times it was shared, retweeted, things like that.
Great, Tessa, thank you for that. I don't know if Matt or Rose or Marta, Wilfrido, if you want to add something regarding metrics in order to kind of assess the impact of your communication plan, strategy, or specific action?
I don't really have anything to add. That's
okay.
That's not really an area of my expertise. I think Tessa explained it very well. You know, we would follow her lead and what she did.
Great. Yeah. I don't know if our colleagues from ENA or Wilfrido. No? Can I jump onto?
I maybe can just add a word. For us was very important also some qualitative measures based on more on the human approach. So we run some interviews. So really to understand what was to high-level people on the different emergency call centers, what were their thoughts and their feelings. And for us was quite important because for now other metrics are still difficult to assess.
Agreed. Wilfrido, you wanted to say something? Wilfrido, ¿algo que agregar a esto o puedo seguir?
Sí, yo pienso que...
Yes, thank you. I think that in communications, you have to be very careful. I always use the soccer metaphor. When there's a soccer match, everyone knows how to play. They know who the goalie is, who the coach is, and in communications, it's the same thing, especially emergency communications. All the teams in the different areas. Even people who aren't communications experts suddenly know exactly what should be done. You should do this. You shouldn't do this. How come this other person isn't speaking? And you have to be careful because things get subjective. What I want to communicate is not necessarily what the public wants to know. That's where you have to be careful. What I want to communicate is not necessarily what the media want to hear and convey. And as for metrics that Tessa spoke about, we worked on an interesting metric for decision making. And for instance, the number of large gatherings during the health emergency, number of clandestine parties, things like that. That's what we were measuring. So we know where are these large gatherings happening and why is this important, so that the authorities managing the health emergencies can impose certain restrictions in those sectors of the population. So I agree with Tessa that the metrics and the mathematical matrices have been very useful during the health emergency for purposes of taking radical decisions sometimes to get those levels of community spread down.
Now, just a final point that I would like to make is how, for example, Rose, when you were talking about domestic violence, and Wilfrido, when you were talking about the use of CCTV cameras to identify incivilities, how mining the data or the videos, that can also be a really important source of information to then tailor specific messages to reach to specific populations and try to either protect, in this case, women from domestic violence, and in Ecuador to try to curb these incivilities and try to kind of contain the spread of the virus. So I think that these emergency and safety agencies can be sources of very important data to inform communications campaigns and strategies. So that's something that I wanted to stress. And I think that we are about to end. It's already 1.3 minutes. So what I want to say just to finish is to thank one last time to our panelists. Thank you, all of you, for joining here us today in this event. It was really, for me at least, and I know that for others, Giselle already mentioned that, it was very insightful to hear from your experience and from your knowledge in a very, very specific topic with regards to emergency and safety agencies. And I want to also thank all of the people that participated through the Kudo platform, but also through Facebook, and that stayed here with us throughout the event. And we hope that this session has been of interest to you. It has been relevant and useful for the work that you do. And please let us know what you think about this session. You will be receiving after the event a very short survey as a follow-up to this session, because we care about your feedback, and we care about doing things that will serve emergency and safety agencies achieve their goals and their purposes. And also just a final comment for all those who participated, please remember that if we're not being able to download the materials here from the platform, all the materials from this session and from previous sessions are available through the ESS community. So please visit us and please stay connected with us. And I would just like to thank my colleagues from the Department of Public Safety, Paulo, Ursula, Ana Paula, also from conference and meetings, including the interpreters who accompanied us throughout the event, our colleagues from press and conference, press and communications, who contributed to making this event possible. And I also really, really would like to express my special gratitude to our intern, to Stephanie Espinal, for all her amazing and hard work that went into this event. And with that, again, thank you. It was a great panel. Thank you for participating, and turn the floor to Guillermo Moncayo, Acting Director of the Department of Public Security, so that he may close the event with some final remarks. Guillermo, the floor is all yours. If you can request the mic or request to speak.
Gracias, Karen.
Thank you, Karen. I was having trouble with the request button. Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. As we've seen, it was a really rich discussion. Communication strategies are important. They're the basis for response. So we have to be clear what we're trying to achieve and to be concise so as to avoid misinterpretation, especially in the kind of crisis we're experiencing right now. As all the panelists mentioned, in order to have a good communication strategy, in addition to having a solid plan, it's vital to have a well-trained team with clear roles and to convey accurate, reliable information with open channels of communication at all times. Develop consistent messaging. Having said all that, I'd like to express my thanks to all the permanent missions of the OAS member states, the institutions in our countries, our partners, everyone supporting us with these discussion sessions, the materials they've shared. Special thanks to today's panelists. Matthew, I'll just go in order as they appear in my screen. Matthew, Rose, Tessa, Marta, Wilfrido, thank you for sharing your experience and your best practices. From the OAS Department of Public Safety, we are remaining committed to keeping the safety agencies of our hemisphere connected and communicating so that they can share their experiences and apply them based on the realities they face in their countries. I know Karen already thanked everybody, but I have to do it too. A special thanks to Karen too, who's really the pillar of this whole process. Without her efforts, this would not have been possible. And thanks to the team that's behind the scenes, Pablo, Anna, Jane, Ursula, and Stephanie, who've done excellent, tireless work on getting these kinds of events to us, to the conferences department, which provides incredible support behind the scenes. It's vital technical support. Our interpreters who provide simultaneous interpretation throughout, the press department who helps us get these events out. And lastly, I'd like to echo what Marta said, who said that if the public is well informed, we'll all be safer. And that's a really important concept. We'll be continuing to follow biosafety protocols to avoid the spread of this virus and continue to support the special mission of saving lives. Thanks to everyone who participated, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great one. Take
Gracias.
care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a
Bye,
good day.
Tessa. Bye. Bye, Wilfrido. Bye, Marta. Bye, Matt. Enjoy your vacation. Bye. Thank you. Bye, Giselle. Ciao. Gracias.